Ethnoornithology is a pretty new field in some ways. The first full professor of ethnoornithology is one of my advisors, and he's at Oxford. And I think that title is pretty new. So we're all on the cutting edge. And that's an exciting place to be as a scientist. More generally speaking, it's a sect of ethnobiology. And when I was deciding what to do with my PhD, I thought back to a lot of my experiences in the field, where I would visit a place for a few weeks, collect what I needed, collaborate with local people wherever possible, but then ultimately I would go home. And I would always be sitting on the tarmac waiting to take off, asking myself, what did we accomplish here? And is it going to have a life beyond the tenure of our visit, beyond the time frame of this expedition? Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes the answer was no. And for me, the solution to that in many ways lies in that ecotone, that nexus of anthropology and biology. It reminds us that humans are a part of nature, and in our scholarship, we must always fold them into our process, not just in terms of being co-creative and inclusive in the questions we design and the studies we execute, but in our consideration of the broader impacts of that work. What is your research? What is your science doing for people as well as for wildlife? They're all part of nature, and for me, ethnobiology and ethnoornithology, for birds in particular, bring those worlds together in a really constructive way. Inclusion is a critical part of what I do, and it comes from my own experience of being neurodiverse and not feeling like I was good enough to be a scientist, only to find that I was more than qualified. I just had to find my own way in. So opening those doors is part of it, and co-creating and co-owning things addresses a really critical problem in how we've done research and storytelling for the past century, if not more. A lot of science and a lot of media is very extractive. People go in, they collect things, they maybe pay a small pittance to the local people as guides for a day, and then they get out. Meanwhile, those people's faces are showing up on billboards in Times Square, and you have to wonder, how is that benefiting them? Is it really a circular process? And the answer is usually no. Justice and inclusion are not trends. They're not things to seize on because it's hot right now. It is a centuries-long, multi-generational process that we must engage constantly in order to reprogram how we do this work. I think until we do that, we're going to limit our own abilities because we will not diversify the ways we think about stewardship, conservation, and just leaving the world better than we found it. We'll continue to perpetuate these extractive, frankly, colonial practices that have gotten us into this sticky situation in the first place. This aggregation of resources, of wealth, of power, leaves a lot of damage and destruction in its wake. We need to stop extracting things from each other and other non-human beings and places and start thinking about how we can give back and lift while we climb. It's easy to talk about this in catchphrases, right? A lot of people have buzzwords. I've used a few. But the rubber meets the road when you actually change your process and have concrete pieces. So, for example, I write contracts for all of my collaborations and for everyone who joins my projects. And they are translated to the native language of whoever's working on them. We review them and we edit them together. Yeah, the process takes longer, but efficiency is not the only goal here. Productivity is oppression if you let it become that. So let's not be so focused on deliverables and instead on what the long-term gains are. The communities I work with own the things they create, and they let us use them for projects with their permission. They get to be involved in the conception of the research questions, the study design, and then they review the papers and they become co-authors. They get credit and their names are on what we make. And then they get to review things that perhaps go further down that pipeline. because we go to the headwaters of knowledge where we do the research, and then we go to the delta where we share it with the world. That process is something where they need to be included at every step. And ideally, when you share something, it's not just a one and done, look what we did, isn't that nice kind of approach. You have to have it come back and feed the process again. So when we look at the impact of a film, let's say, it's not the number of view counts. It's not the amount of money that someone paid to buy it and put it on their streaming platform. It's about change on the ground where it took place. That's something I'm still learning about how to do. And it's something I'm really excited to take forward in my practice as a next step. I want to know, what does it mean to make this media for real? Is it actually making a difference on the ground in the places where the stories took shape? And if not, how do we change that? How do we fix our models so it's not just about virtue signaling and extraction and saying what a difference we've made for ourselves? Let's go back to where it came from and talk to the people who lived there. Well, a scientist fresh out of their PhD always has a challenge of distilling 5 to 10 years of work into a sentence or two. Every time I do it, it's a bit different. But in short form, about a year ago, I was in a stadium filled with birdsong. It wasn't coming from the speakers, wasn't coming from birds in the sky overhead. It was coming from cages, hung by the hundreds in the rafters as thousands of people cheered in the stands all around. And I sat ringside and watched as a squadron of human judges patrolled the arena, rating these caged birds' performances on their songs, plumage, and movement. This is Indonesia's bird singing competition, and after 14 hours of that competition, champions were crowned and their owners went home with huge prizes that can sometimes be very valuable. You can win, I think, up to 10 years salary in a single contest sometimes. It's really it's a dramatic financial opportunity. These competitions have evolved from a centuries-old tradition of keeping birds in cages, which is tied up in a lot of identity for people in Southeast Asia, particularly for the Javanese. But unfortunately, with the increased popularity of keeping caged birds and now the financial windfalls of these singing contests, there is a multi-billion-dollar songbird trade. It's worth about $1.2 billion just in Indonesia, and it creates jobs for people all over the country, but it also generates this insatiable demand for wild-caught birds, which constitute the majority of the birds in trade. And as a result, 43 species of songbirds across Southeast Asia are currently facing accelerated rates of decline because of threats from the wildlife trade. Now, if this breaks your heart, you're not alone. I was shocked to learn this and astonished that people could share my passion for birdsong and take it in such a different direction. I wasn't alone either. I recruited a group of 19 Indonesian students and researchers to work with me to document this songbird trade from the forest to the stage. So we equipped people with documentary field kits, cameras, microphones, sound recorders, interview packets, and we interviewed people at every step of this journey, trying to understand the human motivations as well as the impacts on the birds. And we ended up creating several things. The first is a literature review examining how people describe this songbird trade in academic and mainstream media. And we looked at the last 30 years of research. And from that, we found that it was a pretty black and white picture. A lot of these stories would paint particularly bird keepers as villains in a tragedy of natural history. But I can tell you, there's no faster path to conservation failure than to show up in Southeast Asia, especially looking like me, and start pointing fingers and saying, you did this, and it's all your fault. You're going to burn bridges immediately. That's how we get these entrenched stalemates with no ability to act. The ground is laden with trigger words and phrases, and we can't even talk to each other. So let's stop that. Let's back up and instead give particularly Indonesian people a chance to describe the tradition and the problems in their own words. So by giving them I trained them in documentary film techniques and journalism and research ethics, and effectively brought them to these different places on this pathway. And they interviewed people, and we created a photo voice study where we analyze our media and compare international perspectives like the ones I described with what they find. And from that, we produced, well, from that we found that many of our subjects already had solutions for balancing nature and culture. And so it's our job to listen and amplify. People will pivot from hunting birds to watching birds and leading nature guides. Because let me tell you, a former poacher is incredibly skilled at finding wild birds. And so it's just a natural shift and at the same time, a change in livelihood is no small thing. So you have to leave space and time and make sure there are proper supports in place for people to make those changes. Other people will start new collaborations around breeding birds in captivity and trying to substitute captive bred birds for wild caught birds. Now, that creates some problems with accountability, because it's easy to pretend that a wild caught bird was bred in captivity. All you have to do is fabricate a little ring and stick it on its ankle and say, yeah, I bred this in my house. There's a lot of laundering going on. But there are some bird keeping organizations that are interested in protecting the wild birds as well as the captive birds. But they care especially about their tradition. It's kind of like hunting in the United States. You know, and there are many ways to describe this, but you know, you can protect the tradition, you can protect the wildlife. The two reinforce each other. But we learned even more when we took all that media and we made it into a curriculum for the public school system. We published a book and distributed it through all the schools where we worked. And over the course of about 6 weeks, we taught several lessons in a mixture of English and Indonesian. They wanted me to speak English as a native speaker. It was kind of a cool learning opportunity for the students. But it's so much more powerful when you give people the chance to make their own decisions about how to be stewards of the planet. And when we made our curriculum, we didn't pull any punches. We said to them, there are multiple ways of appreciating birds in your community, and whichever one you decide to choose, please do so responsibly. So we co-authored this curriculum with members of the bird keeping world, as well as biology teachers in the public school system and my cohort of researchers that I've been connected to. So all of us had this input, and then my students who had captured the media came back and taught the classes. And I got to see them blossom into their own mentors. And they had mentees all around us. That was a proud dad moment for me, just seeing them take the reins like that. And then the last thing we did was create a touring photo exhibition called The Price of Beauty, made from my students' media, with a few additions from me here and there. But it's a touring space where we have tapestries that are suspended in air and designed like a bird cage. And you can enter the bird cage, and there's an interactive tapestry at the center where you can write some key phrases about what you think matters most about songbirds. And every time we take this on tour to a new location, that tapestry fills up with more languages, more ideas, written in different colors. It's an interactive space where people can see themselves represented in a discussion about our collective future. And it was especially meaningful to bring that back to Yogyakarta and invite all the people we interviewed to come back and see themselves in that space. They're in the photos. And they got to sit down and talk with each other across this artificial boundary between bird lovers. We got to break down some of that division and just talk about what compromise might look like. And it was, you know, we're still, this is an ongoing project, so I can't really give you a lot of conclusions because it's alive. I'm a student to this day. I may be done with my degree, but I learn every time we bring this exhibit to a new place what it means to love birds and how we might work together to save them.